Poison in the Petunias, a cozy Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1A, Blooming Malice. The village of St. Mary Mead existed in a state of perpetual, gentle slumber, where the most pressing drama was often the rising price of wool, the unpredictable texture of Mrs. Bantry's seed cake. But on the day of the annual summer flower show, the entire village awakened, buzzing with peculiar, refined energy. The green was a tapestry of vibrant color and meticulous organization. Neat rows of marquees and trestle tables displayed the fruits of a year's labor, glossy vegetables, translucent jams, and, most importantly, a breathtaking array of flowers. On a wrought iron bench positioned under the dappled shade of a great oak tree sat Miss Jane Marple. It was a vantage point that offered a perfect, unimpeded view of the entire proceedings. In her lap, a piece of complex lace knitting lay temporarily still. Her bright, bird-like eyes were not fixed on the floral displays, but on the people who cultivated them. "Human nature is so very transparent," she murmured to her companion, a younger woman who had come to view the show. "One sees the same patterns year after year, only the names and the faces change. The ambition, the jealousy, the sheer, unvarnished pride, it all blooms more vigorously than any flower here." She gestured subtly with her chin. "Observe Mr. Arthur Rigby, for instance." A thin, stooped man in a tweed waistcoat fussed over a display of magnificent dinner-plate-sized dahlias. His hands, stained with soil, adjusted their positioning with nervous precision. He has been trying to win the Premier Dahlia Cup for 15 years. 15 years of being beaten, always by the same person. His smile is all congratulations, but his eyes tell a different story. He reminds me so much of old Mr. Henderson, who was convinced the vicar's wife was hexing his gooseberries. Her gaze then drifted to a young woman with a pretty, sun-kissed face currently clouded with anxiety. This was Flora Jenkins, arranging a simple but charming basket of wildflowers and cottage garden poses. Poor Flora! Her family has lived in Hollyhock Cottage for 3 generations. It is the only home she has ever known. And now she lives under a very large, very dark shadow. The shadow in question was Mrs. Letitia Blackwood. If St. Mary Mead had a queen, it was she. Wealthy, widowed, and witheringly sharp-tongued, Mrs. Blackwood didn't just participate in village life. She presided over it. She swept onto the green, a vision in lavender silk, her posture ramrod straight. Following in her wake, like a tired tugboat behind a great ocean liner, was her companion, Miss Eleanor Swift. A mousy, faded woman of indeterminate age, Miss Swift carried a large tapestry bag and an expression of perpetual, gentle apology. The epicenter of Mrs. Blackwood's domain was not the main marquee, but a special, solitary plinth under a small, white canopy. On this velvet-draped pedestal stood a single, breathtaking plant, a specimen of Petunia nigra, the black velvet petunia. Its flowers were a profound, velvety purple so deep it appeared black, a color so rare and difficult to cultivate that it was the undisputed star of the show. They were her masterpiece, her obsession. "A remarkable color," Miss Marple observed, though her tone was neutral. "So deep it seems to absorb the light. Almost funereal, wouldn't you say?" Before her companion could answer, the final key player arrived. Dr. Edmund Sterling, the local general practitioner, made his way through the crowd. He was a kind, capable man in his 50s, but today he looked weary and preoccupied. He exchanged a few quiet words with Mrs. Blackwood, and she waved a dismissive, almost irritated hand at him. He retreated, a faint flush on his cheeks. "Dr. Sterling looks troubled," noted the younger woman. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her gaze thoughtful. "He has been visiting the Grange rather frequently of late. Mrs. Blackwood has been complaining of palpitations. Or so she says. I suspect she simply enjoys having a captive audience for her complaints." The judging began. The officials, led by a formidable expert from the Royal Horticultural Society, moved from display to display. The tension was palpable. They paused at Mr. Rigby's dahlias, and he held his breath. The head judge nodded, made a note, and moved on. Rigby's shoulders slumped slightly. Then they arrived at Mrs. Blackwood's petunias. A hush fell over the immediate vicinity. The judge leaned in, his eyes widening at the extraordinary color. And then he did something unusual. He didn't just look. He leaned in very close, and he sniffed the blooms. Deeply, he then nodded, a look of profound appreciation on his face, and made a generous notation on his clipboard. Mrs. Blackwood's victory was a foregone conclusion. When her name was called for the Premier Flora Cup, her smile was one of pure, unadulterated triumph. A small, polite applause rippled through the crowd. The climax of the ceremony was a traditional toast, poured from a special cut-glass decanter reserved for the committee. A glass of golden sherry was handed to the beaming Mrs. Blackwood. "To St. Mary Mead," she declared, her voice carrying across the green, "and to the relentless pursuit of beauty." She raised the glass to her lips and took a long, satisfied sip. For a moment, everything was as it should be. The sun shone. Then Mrs. Blackwood's face changed. The triumph in her eyes flickered and was replaced by confusion, then by dawning horror. She made a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her throat. The beautiful sherry glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the grass. She staggered back one step, then two, before collapsing in a heap of lavender silk, her body crashing directly into the plinth holding her precious, deep black petunias. The pot wobbled, tilted, and then fell, its dark, velvety bloom scattering and crushing beneath a .pa. Chapter 2. The Scent of Suspicion. For a moment, there was no sound on the village green but the lazy buzzing of a confused bee and the distant, oblivious chirping of a sparrow. The collapse of Mrs. Letitia Blackwood was so sudden, so absolute, that the collective mind of St. Mary Mead could not immediately process it. The scene held its breath, a frozen tableau of shock painted in the brilliant summer sun. Then the spell broke. A woman screamed. The sound was sharp, jagged, tearing through the placid air. It was followed by a surge of movement, a confused jostling as people either recoiled from or rushed towards a lavender-clad figure lying motionless amidst the ruins of her own triumph. The cheerful brass band, which had been poised to launch into a celebratory tune, fell silent, one trumpet emitting a final, sour note. It was Dr. Sterling who first broke from the stunned crowd, his medical training overriding the general paralysis. He knelt on the grass, his movements brisk and professional. His fingers sought the pulse at Mrs. Blackwood's wrist, then her neck. His face, already lined with care, seemed to age a decade in those few seconds. He looked up, his eyes scanning the circle of horrified faces until they found the vicar's. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced, his voice hollow, carrying a weight of finality that seemed to press down on the gathering. "It appears to have been a catastrophic heart attack. The excitement, the strain." A murmur of sympathetic, terrified agreement rippled through the crowd. A heart attack. It was sudden, it was tragic, but it was natural. It was an explanation they could understand, a label they could apply to the unthinkable that would allow them to neatly package their shock and carry on. The collective posture of the village relaxed by a fraction, ready to accept this narrative of simple, cruel fate. But on the bench under the oak tree, Miss Marple did not relax. Her knitting lay utterly still in her lap, a complex, half-finished snowdrop frozen in time. Her bright blue eyes, sharp as a robin's, were not fixed on the body, but on the details of the scene. They took in the specific pattern of the shattered crystal glass, the way the dark sherry had soaked into the thirsty earth. They studied the crushed, velvety petals of the Petunia nigra, their profound black now smeared and broken. They noted the precise distance between the body and the plinth, the angle of the fallen plant. Most of all, her gaze swept over the faces of the crowd, cataloguing reactions. She saw the genuine, hand-over-mouth horror of the vicar's wife. She saw the pale, stunned disbelief of many. And she saw, with a quiet, clinical interest, the subtle shifts in the expressions of select few. Mr. Arthur Rigby's initial shock had given way to a strange, almost thoughtful stillness, his eyes darting from the body to his own pristine dailies, as if recalculating the standings in a competition that had just been permanently altered. Flora Jenkins had burst into tears, but they were the tears of sheer, overwhelmed panic, not grief. Her hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. Miss Eleanor Swift, the companion, stood as if turned to stone. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, her eyes wide and unblinking. It was not the look of someone who has lost an employer, but of someone who has seen a ghost. It was this last observation that seemed to solidify something in Miss Marple's mind. She rose from her bench, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached the knot of people where Dr. Sterling and the vicar were now standing over the body. Inspector Drew arrived from Much Benham with a predictable air of bureaucratic efficiency. He was a man who dealt in facts, not feelings, in clear lines of inquiry, not the messy, nebulous subtleties of human motivation. He listened to Dr. Sterling's assessment, nodded, and began making notes in a small, leather-bound book. "A tragic business," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The excitement, as you say, Doctor, too much for a woman of her years and constitution. We'll need a statement, of course, but it seems straightforward." It was then that Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft yet carrying an unusual firmness. "Forgive me, Inspector," she began, "but did you not think it odd?" Inspector Drew looked up, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance at the interruption. "Odd, Miss Marple." "The judge," she said, her gaze drifting towards a departing official from the Royal Horticultural Society. "The head judge." When he examined Mrs. Blackwood's petunias, he didn't just look. He leaned in very close and smelled them. Intently. "I have been attending flower shows for more years than I care to remember, and I have never seen a judge do more than look. And petunias, while lovely, have a very, very faint scent. One must get exceptionally close to appreciate it. It is not like a rose or a lily. Why would he feel the need to smell them so deliberately?" The inspector blinked, his train of thought derailed. I'm sure it was just professional curiosity, Miss Marple, admiring the aroma." "But that is just it, Inspector," she persisted gently. "What aroma?" "The petunia nigra is not known for its scent. It is bred for its color, its visual drama. Its perfume is negligible. So what, precisely, was he smelling?" A new, unsettling silence descended upon the group. Dr. Sterling's face, which had begun to regain some of its color, paled again. He looked from Miss Marple to the crushed flowers and back again, adorning horrified comprehension in his eyes. "Are you suggesting—" the vicar began, his voice trembling. "I am not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I am merely observing a curious detail. It is often the curious details, the ones that don't quite fit, that are the most telling. They are like a single wrong stitch in a piece of knitting. If you ignore it, the entire pattern will eventually go astray." Inspector Drew, though skeptical, was a thorough man. The old lady's question, irritating as it was, had planted a seed of doubt. A heart attack was neat and tidy, but a question mark was messy. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. He turned to the constable who had accompanied him. "Secure the area. No one is to touch anything. The glass, the decanter, the flowers. Bag it all. We'll have it looked at." The order transformed the scene once more. The colorful, festive village green was now officially a crime scene. The chalk outline that would soon mark where Letitia Blackwood fell was a stark, gray scar on the vibrant grass. The jovial flower show was over. The hunt, silent and invisible, had begun, and at its center, quiet and observant, stood an old lady with knitting needles in her bag and a mind sharper than any detective's, already piecing together a pattern that no one else could yet see. Chapter 3. A Tangle of Roots. The drawing-room of the Gange, Mrs. Blackwood's residence, felt like a stage after the principal actor had made her final, dramatic exit. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and dried lavender, but beneath it lay a newer, sharper aroma of anxiety and suspicion. Inspector Drew had commandeered the space for his interviews, his solid, practical presence seeming to overwhelm the delicate Chippendale furniture. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner armchair, a spectator to the unfolding drama, her hands resting calmly on her lap, her gaze missing nothing. The first to be summoned was Mr. Arthur Rigby. He entered the room not with the shuffling deference one might expect, but with a strained, self-important air, as if his proximity to the tragedy had conferred upon him a new significance. "A terrible, terrible business, Inspector," he began, without waiting for a question. "But frankly, not entirely unexpected. Letitia, Mrs. Blackwood, was a woman who lived on her nerves. The strain of maintaining such standards, the constant push of perfection, it was bound to tell in the end." He smoothed his waistcoat, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding the empty chair where his rival would never sit again. Can you account for your movements this morning, Mr. Rigby? Inspector Drew asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Movements? I was preparing my display, of course, like everyone else. My dusky monarch dailies don't arrange themselves, you know. His tone was snippy. I was at the Green from 8 o'clock onwards. Dozens of people saw me. And did you approach Mrs. Blackwood's display at any point? Rigby's eyes narrowed. I may have walked past it. One likes to survey the competition. But I didn't touch anything. Why would I? My dailies were a triumph of form and color in their own right. The bitterness seeped through, a weed breaking through cracked pavement. Miss Marple noted how his fingers clenched slightly at the mention of her display. When Flora Jenkins was called in, she was a stark contrast. She seemed to have shrunk, her youthful vibrancy replaced by a palpable terror. She sat on the very edge of the offered chair, wringing a damp handkerchief in her hands. I didn't do anything, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was just arranging my wildflowers. I saw her, of course. Everyone saw her, but I kept my distance. Your family is in a dispute with Mrs. Blackwood. I understand, the inspector pressed, his tone not unkind, but relentless. Flora's eyes filled with fresh tears. She wanted to tear down Hollyhock Cottage, to expand her wretched garden. It's my home. It's all I have. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. She broke down into sobs, her distress so genuine it seemed to fill the room. The inspector, looking uncomfortable, dismissed her after a few more perfunctory questions. A convincing performance of grief, he remarked to Miss Marple once the door had closed. Or genuine terror, Inspector, Miss Marple corrected gently. There's a difference. Grief looks backward. Terror looks forward, to the consequences. She is afraid, but not necessarily of discovery. She may be afraid of losing her home all the same, now that its primary antagonist is gone. It is a complicated sort of fear. Next was Dr. Sterling. He entered with a weary professionalism, but the lines of stress around his eyes were more pronounced than ever. I have already stated my medical opinion. Inspector, he said, his voice tired. It presented as a sudden cardiac event. Given her history of hypertension and the intense excitement of the moment, it is the most logical conclusion. Miss Marple has raised a curious point about the flowers, Inspector Drew said, watching the doctor closely. The judge smelled them, intently. Dr. Sterling's composure flickered. A muscle in his jaw tightened. I'm sure I don't know why he would do that. Petunias have little to no scent. Unless, Miss Marple interjected softly, they have been treated with something. A foliar feed, perhaps, or something else. You were her physician, Dr. Sterling. Were you aware of any unusual treatments Mrs. Blackwood might have been using on her prize plants? Something to enhance their color or their vitality. The doctor's face closed up like a fist. I am a doctor of medicine, Miss Marple, not of horticulture. My dealings with Mrs. Blackwood were strictly related to her health. I know nothing of her gardening methods. His answer was too quick, too sharp. He stood up abruptly. If that is all, Inspector, I have other patients to attend to. The shock of this event will be felt throughout the village. After he left, a heavy silence lingered. The final person of interest was Miss Eleanor Swift. She slipped into the room so quietly she seemed to materialize from the shadows. Her eyes were red-rimmed and downcast, her shoulders hunched. She was a picture of a broken, loyal servant. It was my fault, she whispered, the words barely audible. Inspector Drew leaned forward. What was your fault, Miss Swift? I should have stopped her. I should have seen she was overexcited. I should have, I don't know, done something. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She was demanding, but she was my responsibility. Can you tell us about her state of mind this morning? Was she agitated? Did she seem unwell? She was triumphant, Miss Swift said, her voice flat. She knew she would win. She always wins. She always won. She corrected herself with a little shudder. She had me check the positioning of the petunias a dozen times. She was very particular about them. And the sherry? The decanter? Did you handle those? No. That is always a responsibility of the show committee. I only carried her personal things, a shawl, her smelling salts, her notebook. She gestured vaguely to the large tapestry bag at her feet. The interviews concluded, the inspector sighed, running a hand over his face. Well, there we are. A resentful rival, a terrified girl, a stressed doctor, and a guilt-ridden companion. All with opportunity, all with motive, however flimsy. But without proof that it was anything other than a heart attack. It's all just speculation. Just then, the door opened and a young constable entered, looking both excited and grim. He handed a folded piece of paper to Inspector Drew. The preliminary report from the lab. Sir, they rushed it. The inspector's eyes scanned the document. His expression shifted from weary resignation to sharp alertness. He looked up, his gaze finding Miss Marple's. Well, he said, his voice low and serious. It seems your curiosity was warranted, Miss Marple. He placed the paper on the table. The lab found traces of a highly toxic alkaloid on the petals of Mrs. Blackwood Petunias, a poison that can be absorbed through the skin or, if inhaled as a fine dust, through the mucous membranes. The judge didn't smell the flowers. He inhaled the poison. The room fell utterly silent. The genteel mystery had vanished. It had been replaced by the stark, chilling reality of murder. Chapter 4, A Poisoned Legacy. The word, once spoken, seemed to suck all the air from the room. Murder. It was no longer a theoretical question whispered over garden fences. It was a cold, hard fact confirmed by science. The genteel drawing room at the Grange felt suddenly alien, its elegant proportions now framing a scene of brutal calculation. Inspector Drew's demeanor transformed instantly. The weary bureaucrat was gone, replaced by a man whose every sense was now sharply attuned. Right, he said, his voice clipped and efficient. This changes everything. We're not looking for a motive for natural death. We're looking for a killer with specific knowledge and specific access. He turned his attention back to the list of names. Rigby, the gardener, would have the knowledge. Jenkins, the girl, had motive but likely not the expertise. Dr. Sterling has the medical knowledge. And Miss Swift. He paused. The companion would have the access, but the knowledge. Miss Marple, who had been sitting so still she might have been part of the furniture, finally stirred. Knowledge can be acquired, Inspector, she said softly, and motive can be deeply, deeply personal in ways that are not immediately apparent. It is not always about money or property. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think, perhaps, a little air would be beneficial, and a change of perspective. She gave a small, polite nod and gestured for me to follow her. Inspector Drew, preoccupied with issuing new, urgent orders to his constables, barely acknowledged our departure. We did not walk towards a village, but away from it, following a path that led towards a churchyard. The air outside was clean and sweet, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension we had left behind. You see, my dear, Miss Marple began, her eyes on the path ahead. The problem with a murder of this nature is that it requires us to understand two separate spheres, the world of the garden and the world of the heart. The killer resides at their intersection. She paused by a gravestone, its inscription weathered smooth by time. The poison, this alkaloid, it is not something one finds in a common garden shed. It is specific, esoteric. It speaks of a mind that understands potency and delivery. Mr. Rigby would know his chemicals, certainly, but so would a doctor, and so, perhaps, would a dedicated plantswoman. But Miss Swift, I asked, confused. She doesn't seem the type. Doesn't she? Miss Marple countered gently. She has spent years in the shadow of a formidable plantswoman. She has fetched and carried, taken notes, listened to every horticultural conversation. Knowledge, my dear, is often absorbed by osmosis. One learns without even realizing one is learning. It reminds me of old Mrs. Tremlett's housemaid, who never cooked a meal in her life but could recite every one of Mrs. Tremlett's complex recipes by heart, simply from hearing them called out to the cook for 20 years. We had arrived at the lich gate. Leaning against it was a young man in rough work clothes, his face pale under his tan. It was Tom, the under-gardener from the Grange, a simple, honest soul who was clearly in a state of high agitation. Miss Marple, he said, his voice trembling. I heard, is it true, about the poison? In the Petunias. It seems so, Tom, Miss Marple said, her tone kind. A terrible business. It's my fault, he blurted out, his eyes wide with panic. I touched them. I helped Miss Swift move the plant to the plinth this morning. She said the mistress wanted it in just the right light. My hands. I had a cut on my thumb. Do you think? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Miss Swift handled the plant directly this morning. Oh, yes. She was ever so particular about it. Wore her gardening gloves. She did, the thick leather ones. Told me I should wear mine, too. She said the plant was delicate. He held up his hand, showing a fresh bandage. I didn't listen. I was in a hurry. This was a new piece of the pattern. Miss Swift, the timid companion, taking such direct, gloved care with the deadly plant on the very morning of the show. Did you see anyone else near the Petunias? After they were in place. Miss Marple asked. Tom shook his head, then paused. Well, I saw Dr. Sterling. He was walking past the green early, on his way to old Mr. Higgins, I expect. He stopped and looked at them for a long time. He even reached out and touched a leaf, like this. Tom demonstrated a gentle, almost clinical pinch of a leaf between his thumb and forefinger. I thought it was odd, a doctor looking at flowers like that. We left the frightened young man, and began to walk back. The picture was becoming clearer, yet more complex. Miss Swift with her protective gloves and specific instructions. Dr. Sterling with his unusual, examining touch. The poison was on the petals, I mused. But how was it applied? And when? That, my dear, is a question that will find our murderer, Miss Marple said. The when is perhaps more important than the how. Was it days ago, a slow-acting plan? Or was it this very morning, a desperate, last-minute act? The answer to that will tell us much about the state of the killer's mind. A cold, patient planner, or a frantic, cornered soul. She looked towards the grange, its windows staring blankly over the gardens. Everyone is looking for who had a reason to kill Letitia Blackwood, she said quietly. But I find myself wondering more about who had a reason to kill her in that specific way. The method is a message. It is a cool, poetic justice. To be struck down by the very thing she prized above all else, the embodiment of her own pride and vanity. This was not just a removal. This was a statement. As we approached the house, we saw Inspector Drew standing on the doorstep, deep in conversation with a constable who held a small evidence bag. Inside it, visible through the clear plastic, was a pair of sturdy, leather gardening gloves. The hunt was no longer about vague motives. It was now focusing on a specific, poisonous act and the pair of hands that had carried it out. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Secret. The discovery of the gardening gloves, isolated in their clear plastic shroud, landed in the investigation with the weight of a verdict. Inspector Drew held them up, his expression a mixture of triumph and grim satisfaction. Miss Swift's gloves, he announced to us as we approached. Found tucked away at the very back of a gardening cupboard in the shed. She said she hadn't worn them in weeks, but the lab will confirm it. If there are traces of the alkaloid inside these, well, it's as good as a confession. He swept back into the house, the gloves held before him like a holy relic. Miss Marple and I followed, the heavy oak door closing behind us with a sound of finality. The drawing-room felt different now. The air was charged, electric with the prospect of conclusion. Miss Eleanor Swift was summoned once more. She entered, if possible, even more diminished than before, a wisp of a woman fading into the dark wood of the door. Her eyes, red and swollen, fixed immediately on the plastic bag in the inspector's hand. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. Miss Swift, Inspector Drew began, his voice stern, no nonsense. I must ask you again. Did you wear these gloves this morning when handling Mrs. Blackwood's petunias? She stared at them as if they were a venomous snake. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion. I don't remember. I have so many pairs. Perhaps I did. I might have. The under-gardener, Tom, is quite certain you were wearing them. He was very specific. He also said you were unusually particular about the plant's placement. Why was that? The mistress. She was always particular, Miss Swift whispered, her voice breaking. I was only following her wishes. Were you following her wishes when you applied a deadly poison to the petals? The inspector's question was a hammer blow, delivered without subtlety. Miss Swift recoiled as if physically struck. No, never. I would never. I loved her. The cry was torn from her, raw and desperate, so full of genuine anguish that even Inspector Drew seemed momentarily taken aback. It was at that moment of heightened tension that the door opened again. Dr. Sterling stood there, his face a granite mask of resolve. He had not been summoned, but he had come nonetheless. "Inspector," he said, his voice low and steady, "I think you are making a mistake. You are terrifying a harmless woman and overlooking the obvious." "And what, in your opinion, is the obvious, Doctor?" Drew retorted, turning his frustration on the new arrival. "The obvious is that I am your man." A profound silence swallowed the room. I felt my own breath catch in my throat. Miss Marple, beside me, did not react, but I saw her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly on the arm of her chair. Dr. Sterling walked fully into the room, his shoulders squared. "I had the knowledge. I had the access. I had a motive you know nothing about." He looked not at the inspector, but at Miss Swift, and his gaze held a strange, complex emotion, pity, regret, and a flicker of something like defiance. "Letitia Blackwood was not just my patient," he continued, his voice gaining a bitter edge. "She was my creditor. I made some poor investments a few years ago. She loaned me a significant sum to cover them. The terms were severe. She owned me, Inspector. Every month. It was a fresh humiliation. She enjoyed holding that power over a professional man. The constant visit for her palpitations were often just excuses to remind me of my place." He looked down at his hands. "I saw an opportunity this morning. A way out. I had a sample of the alkaloid in my bag. I use a diluted form in certain neurological treatments. When I saw the Petunias, so isolated on their plinth, I acted on impulse. I brushed the petals with a treated fingertip. I thought if she were to have a heart attack after smelling her triumph, no one would question it. I didn't know about the judge. I didn't know the poison could be so easily disturbed." He let out a long, weary breath. "I never intended to harm anyone else." Inspector Drew was staring, his earliest certainty shattered. The case, which had seemed moments from being neatly tied up with Miss Swift's guilt, was now broken open, its pieces scattered in a new and shocking configuration. "You admit to poisoning the flowers?" the inspector asked, his voice hushed. "I do," Dr. Sterling said, his head bowing. "I take full responsibility. Leave Miss Swift out of it. She is innocent." But as the doctor spoke his confession, my eyes were on Miss Marple. She was not looking at the doctor, nor at the weeping companion. Her gaze was fixed on the tapestry bag that still sat at Miss Swift's feet. She was watching Miss Swift's hands, which had ceased their frantic wringing and were now clutching the fabric of her dress, the knuckles white. And on Miss Swift's face, beneath the tears and the shock, there was not relief at this dramatic rescue, but a fresh, more profound kind of terror. Miss Marple leaned towards me, her whisper so faint it was barely a breath. "You see, my dear, the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we confess. They are the ones we allow others to confess for us." Dr. Sterling's confession was a grand, tragic gesture, but in the quiet of that room, it felt less like a solution and more like another layer of misdirection, another petal placed carefully over the dark, poisonous truth at the heart of the matter. The case was not solved. It had simply grown deeper and far, far more sad. Chapter 6. A Devotion Turned Fatal. Dr. Sterling's confession hung in the room, a stark, shocking edifice built on a foundation of professional ruin and personal humiliation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Inspector Drew was the first to break the silence, his initial shock giving way to a pragmatic, almost relieved efficiency. Here was a confession from a credible, educated man. It was clean. It was logical. It wrapped up the messy, inconvenient questions about timid companions and resentful gardeners. "Dr. Sterling," the inspector said, his voice regaining its official timbre, "I must caution you that anything you say—" But Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet unyielding as a slowly flowing river, cut through his procedural speech. "That is a very noble confession, Doctor, and a very foolish one." All eyes turned to her. Dr. Sterling flinched as if struck. Inspector Drew's face flushed with irritation. "Miss Marple, the man has admitted to the crime." "He has admitted to a crime, Inspector," she corrected calmly. "But I do not believe he has admitted to this crime. You see, his story has a flaw, a rather significant one." She turned her gaze upon Dr. Sterling, her eyes holding not accusation, but a profound and weary sadness. "You stated you acted on impulse this morning. You saw the petunias on the plinth and, seized by a sudden opportunity, brushed the petals with a poisoned fingertip." "That is correct," Sterling said, though a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. "But that is not how the poison was delivered, Doctor," Miss Marple said. "The head judge did not merely brush the petals. He inhaled deeply, directly from the blooms. The laboratory report confirmed the poison was present as a fine, particulate dust. It was not a liquid brushed on this morning. It was a powder carefully and evenly distributed. It would have required time to settle, to adhere. It was a preparation, Doctor, not an impulse. It was an act that required forethought, and her eyes shifted to the trembling figure of Miss Swift, a pair of protective gloves. The weight of her logic was immense, pressing down on the doctor's hasty confession and crushing it. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it, the wind gone from his sails. But why would he confess? I blurted out, bewildered. "For the same reason men have always made grand, futile gestures, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her gaze still fixed on Miss Swift. "A misplaced sense of chivalry, or perhaps a deep-seated guilt over another, lest the sin he felt he could atone for with this one grand sacrifice." Now, Miss Marple took a small step towards a companion. "Miss Swift, Eleanor, the truth, now, I think, the doctor has tried to take the blame for you, but the facts will not allow it. The method betrays you. This was not a crime of passion or financial desperation. This was a crime of meticulous, possessive care, the kind of care only you possessed." Miss Swift did not look up. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "You loved her," Miss Marple continued, her voice softening further, becoming almost hypnotic. "Not in the way the world understands love. Perhaps it was a devotion that had become your entire world. You curated her life, managed her household, protected her from every minor annoyance. You were the guardian of her realm. And then you saw threats emerging that you could not manage with your usual efficiency." Miss Marple paused, letting the words sink into the tense silence. Mr. Rigby was a nuisance, but a familiar one. Flora Jenkins was a temporary obstacle. But Dr. Sterling, he was different. He was becoming a constant presence. His debts, his vulnerabilities, made him a permanent fixture in her life. You saw the way she spoke to him, the power she wielded over him. You saw a bond forming, a dependency that did not include you, a dependency that threatened to make you redundant. A raw, guttural sound came from Miss Swift. It was the sound of a dam breaking. She was going to change her will, the woman whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "She told me last night she was going to forgive his debts, to give the poor man a fresh start. After everything I had done, after years of loyalty, of enduring her tempers, of making her life perfect, and she was going to throw it all away on him. She was going to leave me with nothing. Nothing." Her head snapped up, and the terror in her eyes was now replaced with a blazing, righteous fury. She didn't appreciate what she had. She didn't appreciate me. Those petunias, they were her pride, her joy, the one thing she loved more than anything. It was poetic, that they should be the end of her. I prepared the powder days ago, from the seeds of a plant in the greenhouse. I knew the judge always examined her entries closely. I knew he would lean in. I wore the gloves to dust the petals this morning. It was all so simple. She looked directly at Dr. Sterling, her expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "And you pathetic man, you thought you could save me? You thought this was about you? This was never about you. This was about her and me. It was always about us." The silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before. The genteel companion was gone, and in her place stood a woman possessed by a love so twisted it had become a murderous obsession. She had not killed out her hate, but out of a desperate, deranged need to preserve the only world she had ever known, a world that was about to cast her out. Dr. Sterling stared at her, his face a mask of horrified revelation. His confession had been an act of pity for a helpless creature, but the creature before him was not helpless. She was a force of nature, warped and destructive. Inspector Drew, looking pale and slightly shaken, slowly approached Miss Swift. "Eleanor Swift," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier bluster. "I am arresting you for the murder of Letitia Blackwood." As he spoke the formal words, Miss Marple turned away, her eyes closing for a brief moment. There was no triumph in her demeanor, only a deep, abiding sorrow. The mystery was solved, the puzzle complete. But the picture it revealed was not one of cleverness, but of a profound human tragedy blooming in the shadow of a perfect, velvet black petunia. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The silence in the drawing-room was no longer tense with anticipation. It was heavy with the grim finality of a closed case. Inspector Drew's words of arrest seemed to hang in the air, a formal shroud settling over the wreckage of Eleanor Swift's life. The raw, furious confession had stripped her of the last vestiges of the timid companion, revealing the desperate, obsessive architect of murder beneath. As the inspector led her away, her head was held not in shame, but with a strange, broken pride. She had defended her world to its ruinous end. Dr. Sterling stood motionless, a man who had tried to be a gallant knight only to discover the damsel was a dragon. His face was ashen, his professional composure utterly shattered by the revelation of the dark, possessive currents that had flowed so close to him, unseen. The following hours were a blur of official procedure. Statements were finalized. Evidence was logged. The tragic, sordid tale of Letitia Blackwood's death was neatly packaged for the coroner's court. Inspector Drew, while professionally satisfied, seemed subdued. The solution had not been a clean triumph of logic over chaos, but a descent into a private madness that left a sour taste. It was late afternoon when the last police vehicle crunched down the gravel drive of the Grange. The house, now empty of its central figures, seemed to sigh, its rooms settling into a profound and melancholy silence. I walked with Miss Marple back towards her cottage. The vibrant summer day felt like a mockery, the cheerful birdsong and the scent of honeysuckle at odds with the darkness we carried with us. "It is a terrible thing," Miss Marple said at last, her voice soft as the evening breeze, "to be so consumed by love that it becomes a prison, both for the keeper and the kept." She did not see herself as a murderer. You know, in her mind, she was a preservationist. She was pruning a weed that threatened her entire, carefully cultivated garden. We walked on in silence for a few moments before she continued, her thoughts turning to the doctor. Poor Dr. Sterling. His confession, while misguided, was not entirely without its own kind of truth. He was guilty of the weakness that made him vulnerable to Mrs. Blackwood's manipulations, guilty of a pride that made him think he could atone for one sin by embracing another, greater one. He will carry that, I think, long after the memory of this day has faded for the rest of the village. As we passed the vicarage, the vicar himself emerged, his kind face etched with concern. "Miss Marple, a most dreadful business. To think such a tragedy could unfold amongst us. It shakes one's faith in the essential goodness of one's neighbors." "It is not a matter of goodness, vicar," Miss Marple replied, pausing, "but of human nature in all its complex and often tragic variety. Even the most beautiful rose has thorns, and the most tranquil pool can conceal deep, tangled roots. Our task is not to be surprised by the thorns, but to understand why they grow." Back in the familiar, comforting clutter of her own sitting room, Miss Marple finally took up her knitting. The needle began their soft, familiar click-clack, a sound as steady and reassuring as a heartbeat. I sat opposite her, the events of the day swirling in my mind. "But how did you know, for certain, it was her?" I asked. Dr. Sterling's confession was so compelling. "The method, my dear, always reveals the mind," she explained, her eyes on her work. An impulsive man like the doctor, acting in a moment of desperate opportunity, would have used a liquid, a smear, something quick and dainty. The even distribution of a fine powder spoke of patience, of care, of a meticulous nature. It was the act of a housekeeper, a curator. It was an act of maintenance. She looked up, her gaze clear and direct. And then there was the motive. Mr. Rigby's motive was horticultural pique. Flora Jenkins's was fear for her home. Dr. Sterling's was financial desperation. But Miss Swift's motive was the most powerful and the most dangerous of all, the terror of being rendered obsolete, of losing her purpose, her identity, her entire reason for being. When a person's world is that small, any threat to it can seem to justify any action. She sighed, a small, weary sound. I have seen it before, in smaller ways. The secretary who sabotages a rival to maintain her position of trust. The daughter who isolates an aging parent to keep control of the household. It is a distortion of love, a possessive instinct that confuses ownership with devotion. Miss Swift did not kill the woman she hated. She killed the woman she loved too much to share, and in doing so, she destroyed the only thing that gave her own life meaning. The knitting needles continued their rhythmic dance. Outside, the sun began to dip below the hedgerows, casting long, peaceful shadows across the village of St. Mary Mead. The mystery of the poisoned Petunias was solved. The killer was in custody. But as I watched Miss Marple's serene, sad face in the fading light, I understood that some puzzles, once solved, offer no satisfaction, only a sobering lesson on the dark, tangled roots of the human heart and the strange, poisonous blooms they can sometimes produce. Chapter 8. A deeper shade of green. The following morning, St. Mary Mead had begun, with its remarkable and resilient capacity for absorption, to assimilate the shock. The story of Eleanor Swift's arrest was no longer a raw, screaming headline, but a murmured topic over garden fences, its sharp edges already being worn smooth by repetition and the relentless ordinariness of daily life. The village was stitching the scandal into its vast, intricate tapestry of local history, where it would eventually become just another colorful, if dark, thread. I found Miss Marple not in her usual sitting room, but in her garden. She was on her knees, a trowel in her hand, carefully weeding a bed of lavender. The morning sun was warm on our backs, and the air was fresh, cleansed by a brief overnight shower. It felt, in a way, like a new beginning. "The garden always knows," she said, without looking up, as if continuing a conversation we had already been having. "It understands the necessity of clearing away the withered and the rotten to make room for new growth. It is a lesson we humans often struggle to learn. We cling to the dead branches, sometimes with fatal consequences." She sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with the back of a gardening glove. "The case is closed for Inspector Drew. The who and the how are neatly entered into his ledger. But for us, the living, the more important question often remains. Why, I nodded, leaning against the old stone wall. It seemed so senseless. A life taken over a change in a will, a moment of perceived rejection. "Ah, but you see, it was never about the will," Miss Marple said, her gaze distant, focused on the dewy spiderwebs glistening in the box hedge. The will was merely the final, tangible proof of a fear that had been growing in Miss Swift's heart for years. The fear of being unnecessary. It is one of the most profound terrors a human being can face. We can endure hardship, poverty, even illness, so long as we feel we have a place, a purpose. Eleanor Swift's entire purpose was Letitia Blackwood. Without her, who was she? The prospect of finding out was, for her, more terrifying than murder. She rose stiffly and moved to a wooden bench, patting the space beside her. "It is a pattern, my dear. One I have observed many times, though rarely with such a tragic outcome. The devoted spinster who dedicates her life to a stronger personality, only to find that devotion has become a cage of her own making. She was not just Mrs. Blackwood's companion. She was her creation, and creations have a terrible fear of being unmade." We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the sparrows bickering in the lilac bush. The normalcy of it all was both comforting and strange. "And Dr. Sterling?" I asked. "What becomes of him?" Miss Marple sighed. "He will carry the guilt of his own weakness and the shock of his misplaced chivalry for a very long time. He went to the Grange intending to confess to a crime he did not commit, a grand, tragic gesture to end his own humiliation. Instead, he was confronted with a depth of human complexity he, as a man of science, had never contemplated. It will be a harsh medicine, but it may yet make him a better doctor and a wiser man. He has learned that the heart can suffer from ailments far more subtle and dangerous than mere palpitations. Later that day, a small, quiet ceremony was held at the church for Letitia Blackwood. It was not the grand affair she would have doubtless planned for herself. The vicar spoke of redemption and the mystery of God's mercy. Mr. Rigby attended, looking sober and, I thought, a little lost without his rival. Flora Jenkins was there, her face pale but composed, the threat to her cottage now lifted, leaving only the ghost of its fay. Dr. Sterling stood at the very back, slipping out before the final hymn. Miss Marple and I did not stay long. As we walked away from the churchyard, the first stars were beginning to prick the deep blue of the evening sky. "The village will heal," Miss Marple said, as if reading my thoughts. "It always does. There will be new gossip, new rivalries, new small scandals to occupy everyone's attention. In a month, the poisoned Petunias will be a story to tell visitors, a local legend." "And you?" I asked. "Are you at peace with the conclusion?" She paused at her gate, her hand on the latch. A faint, sorrowful smile touched her lips. "There is no peace in such matters, my dear, only understanding, and the resolve to continue observing, to continue understanding. The world is a garden, and I am but a humble student of its many, many weeds." She turned and went inside, closing the door softly behind her. I stood for a moment in the lane, the scent of night-scented stock filling the air. The mystery was solved, the murderer revealed. Yet, as I looked up at the countless stars, I felt the truth of Miss Marple's words. The puzzle of the Petunias was complete, but the greater, endless puzzle of human nature remained, its patterns repeating in an infinite, heartbreaking, and fascinating design. And in her quiet cottage, I knew the knitting needles had already begun their work again, ready to untangle the next thread that life saw fit to snarl. Chapter 9. The Quiet Aftermath. A week passed in St. Mary Mead with the slow, measured pace of a convalescence. The initial, fevered excitement surrounding the death of Letitia Blackwood and the arrest of Eleanor Swift had broken, and the village was now in a state of quiet recuperation. The story was told and retold, each telling sanding down the sharper, more horrifying edges, until it began to take on the quality of a local legend, a dark fairy tale from which one could draw a moral. I found Miss Marple one afternoon not in her garden, but in the village shop, engaged in a profoundly ordinary act of purchasing a bowl of grey wool and a tin of plum preserves. Mrs. Cleet, behind the counter, was holding forth on the subject of nerves. And I said to my sister, "It just goes to show, doesn't it? You never can tell what's going on behind a quiet face. All those years, fetching and carrying, and all the while, well—" She shook her head, packing the preserve with undue force. "It's enough to give anyone nerves." "Indeed, it is a distressing business," Miss Marple agreed, her tone neutral. "But it is often in the quietest corners that the most determined struggles take place. It reminds me of a seemingly placid pond I once saw. On the surface, not a ripple, but beneath, the weeds were so thick and tangled a swimmer would have been caught fast." Mrs. Cleet blinked, slightly nonplussed by the analogy, but nodded sagely as if she understood perfectly. It was a masterful performance. Miss Marple had neither agreed nor disagreed, but had offered a perspective that gently complicated the simple narrative of the mad companion. As we left the shop, I remarked on it. "You are already helping them to understand, in their own way." "Understanding is a kind of healing," she replied. "A simple monster is frightening. A complex tragedy is manageable. It allows people to feel pity alongside their horror, and pity is a gentler emotion than fear." Our walk took us past Hollyhock Cottage. Flora Jenkins was in her front garden, not arranging competition flowers, but simply weeding her borders. She looked up as we passed, and for the first time, her smile was not shadowed by anxiety, but was open and genuine. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she called out. "The lupins are coming along nicely this year." "I'm very glad to hear it, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "A garden thrives so much better when it is tended without a shadow hanging over it." Flora's smile deepened, and she nodded, a world of unspoken meaning in the gesture. The threat was gone. Her small, cherished world was secure. Further along, we encountered Dr. Sterling emerging from a patient's gate. He looked tired, but the harried, desperate look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim steadiness. He saw us and paused, tipping his hat. "Miss Marple," he said. His voice was quiet. "I find I owe you a debt of thanks. Your clarity prevented a grave miscarriage of justice. I believe you would have found your own way to the truth in time, Doctor," Miss Marple said kindly. "The weight of a false confession is a heavy one to bear indefinitely. The truth, however painful, allows the wounds to properly heal." He gave a slow, acknowledging nod. "It is a different kind of pain. Sharper, but cleaner." He looked down at his medical bag. "It has reminded me that my duty is not just to diagnose illness, but to understand the patient. A lesson I shan't soon forget." With another brief nod, he continued on his rounds, a figure who had been humbled and strangely strengthened by his brush with tragedy. Later, as we took tea in her cottage, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window and illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air, I asked Miss Marple the question that had been lingering in my mind. "Do you think she was always like that, Miss Swift? I mean, or did the years of service warp her?" Miss Marple poured the tea with a steady hand. "That is the great question, isn't it? Was the poison always in the seed, or was it cultivated by the soil in which it grew?" I leaned toward the latter. I believe Eleanor Swift began as a capable, perhaps even a loving, young woman. But devotion, when it is not reciprocated with respect, can curdle. It becomes a form of servitude, and the soul can rebel against servitude in the most terrible ways. She poured everything she was into Letitia Blackwood until there was nothing of herself left, and when she saw that her entire investment was about to be liquidated, she destroyed the asset. It was a catastrophic failure of the spirit. She sipped her tea, her gaze thoughtful. It is a warning, I think, against making another person the sole source of our meaning. We must all have our own garden to tend, our own patch of soul to cultivate. Otherwise, we are at the mercy of the climate in someone else's world. The following day, a letter arrived from Inspector Drew. Miss Marple read it aloud to me. It was brief and to the point. The forensic analysis had conclusively matched the alkaloid residue inside Eleanor Swift's gardening gloves to that on the Petunias. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, she had reiterated her confession in full, providing a calm, chillingly detailed account of her actions. The case was now with the Crown prosecutors. "There," Miss Marple said, setting the letter aside. "The final piece of the official puzzle is in place." But as I looked at her, I knew that for Miss Marple, the puzzle had never been solely about the gloves or the poison. It had been about the why. And in the quiet of her cottage, and in the slowly healing rhythms of the village, she had found her answer. It was not an answer that brought joy, but it brought a sense of order, a tragic understanding that, in its own way, was a form of peace. The curtain had fallen on the drama, and now, in the stillness of the aftermath, the true meaning of the play was settling into the hearts of its audience. Final chapter, a pattern completed. The case of the poisoned Petunias, as the newspapers had rather sensationally dubbed it, reached its legal conclusion with a quiet efficiency that belied the turmoil of its discovery. Eleanor Swift was sentenced to life imprisonment, a verdict delivered in a somber courtroom far from the tranquil lanes of St. Mary Mead. There were no dramatic outbursts, no further revelations. She accepted her fate with the same quiet fatalism with which she had orchestrated the crime, a woman already imprisoned long before the cell door clicked shut. In the village, the verdict was met with a collective, subdued sigh. It was an end, a full stop to a sentence that had hung over them all. The last of the police presence vanished from the Grange. The for sale sign that appeared at its gate a month later was not a shock, but rather the final page in a closed book. The house, with its grand rooms and magnificent, now untended gardens, stood as a silent monument to a story that was already receding into local lore. Life, as it always does, continued. The summer ripened into a golden autumn. The vibrant blooms of the flower show were replaced by the fiery hues of turning leaves and the robust, late-blooming dahlias in Mr. Rigby's garden, which, in a poignant twist, finally won him his long-coveted Premier Cup. There was no gloating in his victory, only a quiet, almost respectful satisfaction. It was as if he was honoring the competition itself, now that his most formidable rival was gone. One crisp October afternoon, I found Miss Marple in her usual chair by the window, the gray wool she had purchased transformed into a delicate, intricate shawl. The late sun cast long, amber shadows across her lap. The click of her needles was a peaceful sound, the very rhythm of normalcy restored. "It is a strange thing, justice," she mused, her eyes on the intricate pattern emerging from her needles. "The courts have delivered one kind, a necessary, societal kind, but I am not sure it is the only kind, or even the most important one." I looked at her, curious. What other kind could there be? "The kind that happens here," she said, gently tapping her chest over her heart. "The kind that is understanding. The kind that allows a village to heal, and perhaps allows even the memory of the guilty to be viewed not just with horror, but with a measure of pity. What happened to Dr. Sterling, for instance, is a form of justice. He was humbled, his pride shattered, but he has emerged a better, more compassionate man. He will be a finer doctor for the rest of his days because of this tragedy. That is a kind of redemption." She paused, her needle stilling for a moment, and Flora Jenkins, safe in her home, learning to smile without fear. That, too, is a form of justice. The world has righted itself, not through punishment alone, but through a return to balance. She looked out at her own garden, where the last of the asters and chrysanthemums held their color against the encroaching chill. The puzzle of the Petunias is complete. We have our who, our how, and I believe our why. But the greater puzzle, the one of human nature itself, remains endlessly fascinating. It is a pattern that never truly finishes. We simply complete one section and move on to the next. I understood then that for Miss Marple, the solving of a murder was not a game, nor was it a quest for personal triumph. It was an act of restoration. It was a careful, methodical untangling of a knot that had threatened the social fabric, the reweaving of a torn thread back into the community's tapestry. Her satisfaction came not from the culprit's capture, but from the return of peace, the restoration of order to her small corner of the world. "Will you miss it?" I asked, the excitement of the puzzle. She gave a soft, melodious laugh. "My dear, there is no shortage of puzzles. They may not all be as dramatic as murder, but they are everywhere. In the new family moving into the Grange, and the dynamic they will bring. In the secret romance between the baker's daughter and the schoolmaster. In the small, mysterious theft of eggs from Mrs. Bantry's hen house. Human nature provides an endless supply of mysteries. My task is simply to observe, to understand, and, when necessary, to help gently guide the pattern back to its proper course." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking a soft, steady rhythm once more. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. The village of St. Mary Mead was settling into the quiet of the evening, its lights twinkling on one by one, a constellation of ordinary, peaceful lives. The case was closed. The story was over. But in the quiet cottage, with a gentle click of knitting needles and the wise, watchful eyes of the woman who saw the whole world in a single village, another story was already beginning. The pattern was eternal, and Miss Jane Marple, its most devoted student, was ready for the next thread to appear.